Here we go.
And Ellen is joining us.
Okay, I'll give it another second or two.
Okay.
Okay. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the May 11th, 2023 Connecticut Paid Leave Board of Directors meeting. I would like to call the meeting to order, and the time is 9:02. And Amber, would you kindly take attendance?
Good morning. Yes, thank you, Fran. Ava Bermudez Zimmerman,
Present.
Isha Canada,
Present.
Adrian Cochran. I don't believe Adrian has joined us yet. Britt Marie Cole Johnson,
Present.
Andrea Comer,
Present.
Michelle Gilman,
Present.
Sheila Hummel. I don't believe Sheila has joined us yet. Sal is joining us now. I'll circle back, give him a moment to sign in. Ellen McKitterick,
Present.
Sal Luciano. I'll circle back to you, Sal. Fran Pastori,
Present.
John Scott. I don't believe John has joined us yet. Michael Soltis.
I'm sorry, Amber. Sal is here. I can see him. I think maybe he was having trouble coming off mute. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Sal. Mike Soltis,
Here.
Molly Weston Williamson,
Present.
Holly Williams,
Present.
Justin Zartman. I don't believe Justin's going to be joining us today. We have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. I would like to have a motion to approve the April 13 meeting minutes, which were distributed last week. Are there any corrections or further discussions?
So moved.
Thank you. May I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Any opposed?
And just one abstention because I wasn't here last month. I was
And
out of the
And
country.
neither was I.
Holly Williams as well.
Great. And John, good morning.
Good morning. Sorry I'm late.
Great. Okay, it looks like the motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Dave, would you lead us in the discussion around the bond repayment terms?
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Going to share my screen.
We can see your screen, Dave.
Okay, great. Let me get this in presentation mode. Okay, so we're going to have a discussion this morning on bond repayments by the authority. So just to take a step back and give everybody some background, a few years ago now, I think back in 2019, the authority was authorized $50 million in bonds to fund certain items. The IT systems of the authority in particular, things like our web portal, the employee contribution system, a benefits system, including the appeal system and things like that. Was $25 million in the first year and $25 million in the second year. The statute also requires the authority to reimburse the bond funds back to the state that were allocated to it. And the terms of that are determined by the Office of Policy and Management, which we refer to as OPM, in conjunction with the Office of the Treasurer, which we call OTT. So these past few months, we at the authority have been working with OPM to determine and immortalize the terms of this repayment. In terms of how much we have to pay back, the amount that's been allocated so far is just over $16 million, which will probably seem familiar to a lot of you because that's the number we talk about when we do the financial review every month. Most of that money has been spent on the employee contribution system, almost $8.8 million. And then the second largest expenditure was the benefit claim system, which includes our share of the appeal system that was built by our partners over at DOL. And the total of all that was $3.3 million. And those funds were allocated back in 2020. And then last year in 2022, we had some additional allocations for the fund recovery system, some claims data integration security, website redesign, and things like that. So that's the amount that's currently allocated that we would have to pay back. So what are the terms of the bond repayment? The interest rate is 3.5%, and that's compounded semi-annually. And that was determined by OPM because that was roughly the interest rate of the bonds at the time that the bonds were allocated to the authority. So that's how that rate was determined. The payment term is over a 10-year period. So over that period, once you calculate it, the interest that the authority would ultimately have to pay back in total will be $3.1 million on the $16 million of principal. The payment frequency requires that the authority pay it back to the state once a year by the end of the fiscal year, so by June 30th. The annual payments, principal and interest in year, would start out at $2.2 million, and that would be that starts at the end of this fiscal year, 2023. So the first payment would be by June of this year, and it would be $2.2 million. And then each year the amount goes down a little bit because there's less principal, so there's less interest calculated on the principal, until the last year when the final payment will be $1.7 million. There's no penalty if the authority wants to prepay a portion of the principal back. This was a point of discussion at the Finance Committee last month when we discussed it in terms of when would it be good to prepay. And so one of the items that came of this is that annually we would discuss with the Finance Committee what the authority was thinking in terms of whether we would want to prepay it or not. There's a few factors that go into that. The funds to pay back the bonds, come from the contribution fund. So the contribution fund has to be pretty solid, and we want to make sure we have money for benefit payments and everything else before we would decide to prepay it. The other thing is, as our assistant controller, Locke Fo, pointed out, is what are the interest rates that we're earning in our short-term investment fund compared to the 3.5% that we'd have to pay back. Right now, we are earning north of 4.5% in the short-term investment fund. So we're earning about 100 basis points more now than we would have to pay back. So in the strictest financial sense, it really doesn't make sense to prepay the bonds at 3.5% where we could use the money to earn 4.5%. So if it continues that way, we're more likely not to prepay. Now, if that switches and the short-term investment fund decreases and starts earning less, then that becomes a different discussion and becomes a stronger argument to prepay. But that's just one example. But annually, when it gets closer to fiscal year end, we would talk to the Finance Committee and advise them what our thoughts are at that time, whether we think we should prepay or not. Now, if there's any new allocations that come along, the interest rate would be determined by OPM for those additional allocations going forward. So the 3.5% is only for the $16 million now. If we go to the Bond Commission and have any other bond funds allocated, then OPM in conjunction with OTT would determine the interest rate at that time. Now, if perchance, if the authority was unable to make a payment by the end of the fiscal year, it's required to notify the Office of Policy and Management before June 1st. At that time, OPM has the discretion to determine a new schedule for the authority to pay. That's it in a nutshell in terms of the bond repayment terms that the authority would have with the state, and specifically the Office of Policy and Management in conjunction with the treasurer. Does anybody in the board have any questions?
Dave, that was very clear and succinct. Since nobody has any questions, I am going to ask for a motion to authorize the authority to accept and execute the bond repayment terms.
So moved.
Second that, Scott.
So moved.
Thanks, everyone. A second?
I'll second that, John Scott.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries, and we will move on very efficiently and quickly to item number 5. Dave, would you please lead us in the discussion regarding the draft budget for FY 23-24?
Yes. Okay. Well, hello again. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen for the next presentation. I'm going to apologize if I'm coughing. I feel like allergy season is terrible this year. So of course it came along when I'm doing the most presentations for the board. Timing is everything. Okay.
No worries, Dave.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate everyone's patience and flexibility. All right. Can everyone see the budget presentation?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you for the confirmation, Stephanie. Okay, so it's budget time again, and we are going to discuss our proposed budget for the next fiscal year. Our fiscal year, just as a reminder, is from July through June. So this is the budget for July of 2023 through June of 2024. There are 3 aspects of the budget, which probably be familiar to you as you might recall from me going over the financials on a monthly basis. There is our operating budget, which covers the operating expenses of the authority. There is the bond budget, which covers what we just discussed, bond allocations, right? So that covers any additional allocations that we want to budget for the coming year. And then there is the contribution budget, which is our budget for the contributions coming in, the benefit payments going out, and is the most significant piece of the budget. So we're going to start with the operating budget. Oops, sorry, hold it. Let's go back, jumping the gun a little bit there. Okay. So high level, the operating budget, the revenue we're budgeting is just over $20 million. Most of it is for the administration fee. This is the same amount as last year. There is a small amount for fund recovery penalties. There's a conservative amount. We're going to discuss the assumptions behind those in a minute. The expenses of the authority are budgeted at $17.3 million. A couple of slides from now, we'll do somewhat of a not too deep dive, but deep enough to explain how it compares to last year's budget and our current year projection. But high level, just so you're aware, the $17.3 million is $229,000 higher than last year's budget, or 1.3%. So not too much. The significant categories of the budget are the typical expenses that we've had so far. Salaries, fringe, and pension expenses, which make up $9.8 million of the budget. Those include 4 new positions budgeted for the year, including 2 account examiners and finance, an operations manager, and a paralegal specialist. Also includes money for the contact center with our partners at United Way. That's another $1.6 million. IT support of the contribution system is also an item, although we're budgeting less for that this year because we believe we need less support, outside support, because we have more internal support of it. There's also our outreach and engagement budget of $1 million. That's consistent with last year to continue our outreach efforts, both to employers to make sure they're aware of their obligations and aware to the people of the state to make sure they're aware of the program and if they're eligible for the program to use it. There's also another $1.3 million in grievance adjudication. That's the money we have for those who appeal the decisions or feel that the decision they got, for example, if they were decided that they were ineligible for benefits, they can appeal it. So we've got money set aside for that, for our, and that money is we pay our partners at DOL for that because they are in charge of the adjudication and appeals process. And then we have another $1 million for software licenses for the platform of the employer contribution and all the various software around that. So these major categories make up $15.8 million, or over 90% of the $17.3 million that we've budgeted so far. Just want to discuss a couple of minutes, the significant assumptions behind some of these numbers. On the revenue side, as I mentioned, it was $20 million. That's consistent with last year. At the Finance and Audit Committee meeting, this has come up this year, and actually it came up last year too. One of the items of note is that contributions coming in can be variable, and they're more variable than our operational budget, which tends to be more fixed in nature. And in the past, we had budgeted the administrative fee was budgeted as a % of contributions. And so the point had come up, does that really make sense? Or should we really be budgeting for our operational expenses based on what we know now and not so much as a % of contributions, which we agreed with, and that's what we did this year. We didn't just take a percentage of contributions and budget around that. We looked historically at what our expenses were and what we believe will be and budgeted around that. And so that's what we did. Fund recovery penalty, that's really a very small part of the revenue budget, less than $22,000. We're going to be starting our fund recovery efforts in a month or so. We don't have any history yet to know how much that's going to be. So we budgeted on the low side. We estimated that 2% of our contributions were going to be non-compliant. We would recover 5% of those. And so the penalty would be 10% of that. And so that's the math behind the number. But basically, the takeaway is we budgeted very conservatively on that. And we'll see what happens this year when we have some more history. And so next year, we can budget based more on actual history that we've seen. In terms of expenses, salary, which is one of our larger items, was budgeted to include salary adjustments. That's based on the latest contract with CBAC that was agreed upon last year by the state of Connecticut. So there's a 2.5% adjustment in July. That should actually, I just noticed a typo now. That should actually say July 1st, 2023. And then the 3% adjustment would be on January 1st, 2024. And so those have been included in our budget. The 90% fringe benefit rate for healthcare and pension obligation is consistent with prior years, 23% for the healthcare and 67% for the benefit obligation. Those two components were based on our historical run rate, slightly different than last year's budget, which was 2565, but only slight. Other expenses were based on our historical run rates. There was an inflationary factor that we built in there based on the current economic climate. So we budgeted for inflation where appropriate, usually at a 5% factor. The Finance and Audit Committee had asked how much was that in terms of dollars of total budget, and it was roughly just over $200,000 or about 1.2% of the over $17 million budget. So we budgeted for that, and if there were any additional anticipated needs, we also budgeted for those as well as part of the operations budget. Okay, I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but just bear with me for a minute because we just wanted to explain how the current year budget compares to last year's budget, which is right in the middle of your screen, and the projection, which is on the right-hand side. So on the top part is revenue, and that's consistent across the board. So no deep explanations there. If you look down at the bottom, the variance compared to last year's budget, as I mentioned earlier, was $229,000. So our current fiscal year budget is $229,000 higher than last year's. Why? Well, as I mentioned, the biggest component is payroll, pension, and benefits. We've got wage increases and more staff since last year's budget, so that's going to be higher. We have additional printing and postage needs of over $250,000, and that's going to be because of our fund recovery efforts. We have additional software licenses that we're going to need, including additional licenses for the state website we're going to use. We have private plan audits that we're starting this year, so there's software license for that. We're going to have additional Salesforce content, and Salesforce is the platform that a contribution system sits on. We have an address verification software that we're using in conjunction with fund recovery. The fund recovery, we have our own software for that. We have additional storage needs because we have more data. So all this great stuff is why we anticipate paying more in software licenses in the current fiscal year. Those increases, those increases are offset by a decrease in our IT consulting line, because as I mentioned earlier, there's less of a need for outside IT consultants and IT maintenance because we're doing that more internally now. So that's a decrease of $841,000. There's also a decrease in our actuary budget because last year at this time, we were right in the middle of the RFP process for the actuaries. So we only had an estimate of what it would be. It turns out what we're paying now is less than what we estimated last year. So we budgeted closer to what the contract calls for. So that's why that amount went down. So we had some increases, we had offset by some decreases, and that's why our current year budget is about $229,000 or 1.3% higher than last year. Okay, that's compared to last year's budget. How does this year's budget compare to our latest projection for how we're going to do at the end of this fiscal year, which is roughly $12.6 million? So our budget is roughly $4.6 million higher than the projection. So why is that? Well, the biggest factor is our staffing expense. We have more staff now than we did at the beginning of last fiscal year. We anticipate adding on staff, and the fiscal year 2024 budget anticipates that we will be fully staffed at that time. So that may or may not happen, but we need to budget that way if it does happen, because we don't want to get we don't want to be caught short with anything, obviously. Grievance adjudication this year, we estimate to be lower in the current fiscal year, but we believe that the appeals volume will be increasing in the next fiscal year. And we're budgeting at the amount that roughly we budgeted at last year, even though this fiscal year is lower, because we really don't have a lot of data or history yet from the DOL. They owe us some back billing. We're supposed to get that by the end of this month. So we'll see what that looks like when we get it. But we want to err on the side of caution and not under budget for that line. Printing and postage is higher, as I mentioned. We'll be doing fund recovery efforts a lot more in the next fiscal year than we are now. So that will be higher. Software licenses are also higher for the reasons I just discussed. We have a contingency, $250,000 contingency in our current budget, like we did last year. We didn't use it this fiscal year, but we do have it in there for the things we don't know about. So we just like to keep it there in case there's things that come about, and we want to make sure that we're prepared for them fiscally. And then the IT consulting line, we do expect to spend more in the next fiscal year than we do now. But again, that will be less overall than we've spent in prior years and what we budgeted last year. So all those reasons are why our budget is $4.6 million higher than our current fiscal year. Now, I do want to point out that the authority has the flexibility of not transferring the funds from the contribution fund for operations if we don't need them. So if next year we see that our expense run rate is lower than budgeted, then we will not transfer the revenue amount that's budgeted up top and keep it in the contribution fund where it can earn interest. And then if we need it later, we'll take it later. And if we don't need it, it can stay there. In fact, we're doing that in the latest quarter now because we see our run rate is lower. So we didn't transfer the amount in the latest quarter. So we do have that option, and we do have that flexibility to manage our money appropriately. Thank you for your patience with that. I know that was a lot, but we just wanted to go through with you the numbers and how they compared to prior periods. Going to move on to the bond budget. I'll go through this quickly because we just had a bond discussion. As you know, $50 million authorized, $16 million allocated. We're budgeting an additional $2.1 million for things that include portal enhancements. The user experience, we've added some more information to the user experience. So we want to upgrade and restructure that user experience because of the additional info we have there now to make it a better experience for the user. Private plan renewal administration. Every 3 years, private plans have to renew with the authority. And so we want to build a system that will automate that process to make it easier for the employers of that private plan, and also to make it easier for the authority to administer those private plans. So we have some money. So some of the allocation will be for that. And then finally, the employee contribution system enhancements. We'd like to allocate some money for that, mostly for customer account functionality, things like role and payment method management, registration, view of current status, things like that. Okay, the contribution budget. Our largest piece, the contribution budget, the contributions of the contribution budget. We have budgeted $437.5 million of payroll contributions. I will do a similar analysis in a few minutes of how that compares to prior years. But I do want everyone to know that we did work very closely in conjunction with our actuaries on this. One of the questions that came up at the Finance Committee was, does the estimate include the possibility of a recession? Because there's been listening to the news and stuff like that. There's been talk about that. And the answer is yes. Our actuaries do include a factor for a recession. So there wasn't any additional work we needed to do on that after the Finance Committee had asked about it. But the payroll contribution budget is conservative enough so that if there was a recession, we wouldn't be so far off. Our fund recovery number, again, relatively small compared to the budget. Again, we're budgeting very conservatively for that because we don't have any real history on that yet. So again, we want to err on the side of caution on that. Investment income, $22 million. We have budgeted for that at 4%. As I mentioned earlier, we're earning north of 4.5% on that now. The Fed's just increased the rate, their rate, another 25 basis points. So typically interest rates in a few months follow that. But we didn't want to budget too high on that because, quite frankly, we're living in interesting times and we're not really sure what's going to happen with interest and investment rates. Are they going to continue to go up? Are they going to go down? Not sure. So we did budget somewhat conservatively at 4%, but if the interest rates did go down, we wanted to be ready for that and not budget too aggressively. There's also a small piece of investment income that's budgeted at 3.5% for the money we have at Aflac, because that is earning interest now. It was currently at 3.5%. So part of the investment income does include that as well. Second biggest piece of a contribution budget is the claims amount. That's also conservative in nature, and we absolutely worked with our actuaries on that number. It is based in part on our history for the year. We did budget for an increase in the next fiscal year. And so again, we did budget it conservatively. So it is on the higher side, but again, if it does come to pass, we wanted to be ready for it and make sure that we budget appropriately for it. But we absolutely did work very closely with the actuaries in determining this number. The administrative fee to Aflac, this is the separate fee that we pay to them, is budgeted at $25 million, same as it was last year. Our current run rate is closer to $23 million, but the contract does allow, if the authority agrees, for additional services. So we want to make sure that we did have a budget there in case the authority does agree to those additional services. So this is consistent with last year. There's $20 million budgeted for the authority's administrative fee. Again, that's conservative, consistent with what I showed you earlier, and again, consistent with last year. And finally, the bond repayment budgeted at just under $2.2 million. We went over that earlier, so I won't go over that again, but it is in our contribution budget for the year. These are the assumptions. I basically went over these while I was discussing the numbers, so I won't go over them again, but it's consistent with what I've discussed so far. I do want to point out how our numbers compare to last year's budget and last year's projection. The top part above the thick line is revenue and below it is expenses. I'm going to start with revenue first. So this year's budgeted revenue total of $460 million is about excuse me, $18 million higher than last year's budget. Why? The biggest driver of that is investment income. Last year's budget, you can see, was only 262,000 because we were earning 0.1% at the time. This year, as I mentioned, we're budgeting 4%, and that's the biggest driver of the increase. Contributions were budgeted at a lower amount compared to last year's budget. That was based on the actuarial estimates. We had another year of data, so the actuaries looked at that and determined that we should be budgeting at a lower rate for contributions. In terms of our budgeted revenue of 460 and how it compares to our latest projection of 445, again, similar story to the budget. It's $14 million higher. Why? A big piece of that is investment income, because we'll be earning a higher rate of investment income. And contributions for next year are expected to be higher than what we believe they'll be for our latest projection this year. It's about a 1.8% increase, somewhat conservative, again, because we have things like a recession built in there. So we don't want to be too aggressive with the estimates, but we do have an increase built in there. On the, oops, I apologize for that. A little too quick with the finger. Expenses. Our contribution expenses for next year's fiscal budget are $447 million. Compared to last year's budget of $496 million, that's just over $49 million. Why the decrease? Most of it is a decrease in benefit expense. Last year around this time, we didn't have a whole heck of a lot of benefit expense, only like 2 or 3 months of experience. So our actuaries came up with an estimate of what they thought it would be. Now that we have another year of history, we see the amount coming in is lower, so we're budgeting at a lower rate. And that's actually the same. And so that's the story for compared to last year's budget. What's the comparison look like for our most recent projection for the end of the fiscal year? How we really think we're going to end up? We think we're going to be at about just over $325 million of contributions for the year. We are anticipating an increase next year, so that's why it's going to be over $74 million higher in next year's budget. So we're just expecting increasing usage, and we want to be ready for that. So that's why we budgeted at a higher rate. So what are the next steps for the board? We are reviewing this budget with you this morning, and we'll obviously ask you if you have any questions or comments, but we are asking for a vote this morning to approve the budget, which is consistent with what happened in the past couple of years. If the board does decide that additional time is needed, our plan of operations does require that the budget be finalized by May 31st. Well, it requires that the board approve it by May 31st. So the board would have to vote for a special meeting by May 31st, or they could vote to say, we'll vote on the budget at our next regularly scheduled meeting, which is June 8th, if it comes to that. I know that was a lot, but I really tried to summarize our budget as best as I could. There's obviously a lot going on. We do budget conservatively, but we want to make sure that we have enough in there so we can make sound financial decisions in the coming fiscal year. So those are my prepared remarks. The floor is open if anybody from the board has any questions or comments.
Thank you, Dave, for that very comprehensive presentation. Questions or comments, anyone? Okay, if there are no questions or comments, I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the budget for FY 23-24.
Motion to approve the budget.
John Scott will second that.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Abstentions? Okay, excellent work, guys. The motion carries. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I do want to
Dave,
thank the
thank
board.
you.
Thank you. I do want to thank the board for their support and guidance as always. I do want to thank the Finance and Audit Committee for their input. We couldn't have done it without you. And I do want to throw a special shout out to our Assistant Controller, Locke Foe, who was very instrumental in preparing schedules and following up with staff, and was a big part of helping with it. So I just want to publicly thank him for that.
Teamwork and leadership. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dave, to you and your team. Okay, we're moving on to item 7. Priscilla, would you kindly provide the Claims Administration Quarterly Update?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Everybody see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Ooh, showing that I'm sharing. Hold on. How about now?
We can
Yes.
see your screen.
All right. All right. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to present the claims portion of our meeting. So first slide here. For the first quarter of 2023, we received a total of 22,836 claims with a monthly moving average of 7,612. February was a short month with lower claims. It's a shorter month, so we would expect that. But year over year, claim volume did remain consistent. This next slide represents the first quarter 2023 leave reason with percentage filed by gender. So one thing to note here is that with the recent changes that were made in streamlining the pregnancy and bonding into one case for females under the pregnancy claim, we are starting to see a shift in the male versus female bonding cases. This shows the claims by leave reason as a percentage of the total claims filed for March. And this is the 3-month decision trend for adjudicated claims. So approved claims for Q1 totaling over 15,000 with an approval rate increasing to 67.71%. Denied claims at 7,474 with a denial rate of 32.29%. When you look at cumulative decisions, excluding the COVID claims, it increases the approval rate to 71.63%, and the denial rate decreases down to 28.37%. First quarter 2023, we had total gross payments year to date of just over $101 million. Cumulative gross payments through April 2023 is $350,683,277. So all payment categories saw a significant increase in the year-over-year comparison. Average claim duration has increased slightly year to date 2023 compared to 22, which was expected as the pregnancy case duration increased by absorbing the associated bonding time. One thing also to note here is that the new max benefit rate does go into effect on June 1st due to the increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We are pleased to report over the last 11 weeks, the program has experienced a sustained decrease in customer call volume, averaging 14%, while claims per day remain relatively constant. We believe this is a result of the first quarter system and process enhancements we previewed for you earlier this year. These enhancements include the document dashboard, streamlining of the pregnancy and bonding cases into one single case, more timely return of customer calls and portal messages, and the addition of 5- and 10-day push text reminders to customer smartphones, and also insufficient documentation letters. We have some supporting data we would like to share with you to illustrate the efforts that have produced these results. This shows the time frame for the return of customer calls and messages. Almost all the callbacks and messages have been returned within 1 to 3 business days. And this shows the April data. This has been that the April data has been consistent through 2023. This is the document dashboard that was implemented on February 1st. Customer and AFLAC personnel feedback has been overall very positive. The dashboard has significantly improved the customer's view of their claim document requirements and also how to get those documents to us, and provides individual document status, including any required outstanding documents. We've seen a significant impact to the overall claims experience, and we believe this enhancement is a primary driver of the decrease in call volume. There's also an effort underway to leverage the data in the dashboard to further automate additional customer notices and letters. Data shows that with pregnancy and bonding cases streamlined into one case, female bonding cases have decreased as expected, while the pregnancy cases have remained relatively constant. Actual monthly claim numbers in each category's percentage of total monthly claim intake is also shown. Customer feedback has been very positive on the streamlined process. Survey comments that we've received are such as very easy process, very helpful during pregnancy, very helpful for parents of a newborn, are just a few of the comments that we've received on surveys. The process change has resulted in shorter processing and payment timelines for moms and dads. Bonding claims filed by month shows the expected trend of reduction in total number of bonding cases, while the ratio of male to female cases is increasing. You can see that month over month trend. This slide represents the initial customer service and claims processing impact we have seen as a result of the system and process enhancements of both the document dashboard and the pregnancy and bonding streamlining. From a customer service standpoint, the average calls per claim and callback requests have decreased, while the initial approval rates have increased. As pregnancy and bonding cases are streamlined into one case, female bonding cases have decreased, while pregnancy case durations has increased, which is what we expected to happen. That was all I had to present. Does anybody have any questions?
May I ask a question? This is Mike.
Sure.
Good morning, Priscilla.
Good morning.
The denial rate is still higher than I would have anticipated. And I remember in times past, the main reason for the denial was the claimant's failure to provide all of the required information. And is that still the main reason for the denial of a claim?
It is still the main driver. And with the recent addition of the document dashboard and also the text reminders that just went into place, and also reminder letters, I think my hope is that we'll see that start to come down.
I would also add that the rates that Priscilla shared are the initial denials. So we do get a large number of reconsiderations where people will submit the missing documents. And so a lot of those initial denials do eventually get reversed, but we're still working, as Priscilla said, to really push people to get us the documentation up front. One of the things we're trying to dive more deeply into is to break down the denial because they've given us no documents, which is still a very high percentage. It's a tough nut to crack because it requires people to read and understand sort of the initial requirements. So we're still working on that. And then if they're being denied because they're missing 1 or 2 documents, what are those? Are they primarily employers, which means we really need to be working to tackle the employers to make sure they understand the importance of that employment verification form? Is it the med certs and other claim-related documents, which would require a different outreach? So we're really trying to nail down kind of why it's still so difficult. We do talk to other states. Actually, John and Michael are at a convening right now in Boston of states, and this is not unique to us. People not providing documents is kind of a consistent story across the paid leave programs.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna just jump in. Priscilla, oh, sorry, Britt Marie, go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry, Molly's had her hand up. Could we
Oh,
acknowledge
okay.
Molly?
Didn't see
Sorry.
her.
Molly, go ahead.
Mike took 2/3 of my question, so this will, I hope good. So the 32% number we were seeing is a 3-month number, and it sounds like the document dashboard only went into effect part of the way through that and presumably doesn't have its full impact immediately.
Exactly.
So is it fair to say that we're still hoping that even though we're seeing some of that impact, that we're still hoping that along with all the other changes, that basically things the authority has already done will bring down that denial number in the future? Is that a fair summary of what we're
Yes,
saying?
yes, it is.
Britt Marie.
Thanks, Fran. I'm just curious on the denial numbers. Do we have any demographics data? And do we have any sense for whether this is in part an equity issue or a technology issue in any way?
So that's a really great question. Go ahead, Priscilla.
No, I was just going to say that is something I know that we've talked about. So that is something I think we are looking at and going to look at.
We do track to see how many people are applying online versus through the phone calls, which is a rough indicator of access to computers, right? So still the vast majority of our claimants apply online. So we anticipate that they have access to the document dashboard. Even folks who apply in person do have access to the dashboard. They're not precluded, from our perspective, they're not precluded, but we recognize that that can be tricky. And if you are requesting everything to come through mail, that does add time, and so may have a higher level of initial denials, but it's still something we're trying to tackle.
Molly, is your hand still up?
It is, but since I already talked, I'm happy to wait if other folks want to go first.
Go ahead.
I just had a follow-up question on Britt Marie's question, which is the authority tracking demographics or other statistics about reconsideration requests? Because if we think part of what's happening is reconsiderations are fixing some of the initial denials, I would assume that folks who ask for reconsideration are probably higher income and higher educated than general population, but that's an assumption. So I'm curious about if that's being tracked separately.
We have not asked for reports for that, but that's a really great thing we should be looking at. We do, I can say anecdotally that we get a good number of reconsideration requests, and they're not limited to people in higher wage professions. We see a number of folks who are either earning minimum wage or otherwise lower income workers who are also filing. So at least we feel like that reconsideration process is pretty open to folks, but that's a good thing we should be tracking to make sure it's not just anecdotal.
I wanted to just share some proof points from a completely different industry, but a similar, if you will, application process that ends in a financial benefit. So, you guys all know that I run the WBDC and we have a grant program. And it's an application process and all the documentation. There is no phone call application process. It's all done online. And we have an extraordinarily high number of incomplete applications. And so for the past, I would say, year plus, we've been looking at exactly all of the issues that everyone just brought up. The equity issue, why are they missing 3 documents? Why do they start an application and get halfway through and then give up? And so we're having the same experience and addressing it in a number of ways, and some of which were just raised. But most of the result that we're seeing in the conversion of a denial to a reapplication and then an approval is the outreach on our part, right? So if someone's missing 2 or 3 documents, We're looking at what those documents might be and how simple they might be to get those documents from that person with a little support, guidance, encouragement. It's expensive and it's time consuming. And then with regard to the equity issue, what we're doing is having multilingual folks on our team reach out to say, hey, we want to give you the opportunity to resubmit, and kind of walking them through the process. It is labor intensive. As I said, I don't know that we have the resources for that. I'm just sharing it because it's pretty consistent with what we just discussed and with some of the information that Priscilla presented. So, and Priscilla, thank you so much for the report. Nice
Thank
job.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback, Fran. And Andrea, I do see your hand up. I just wanted to say one thing that Priscilla noted is that we're doing the push reminders to really encourage folks to get their documents in and remind them. And I think we've all become habituated to being reminded multiple times to get things done. And so we're trying to acknowledge that. So we're hopeful that that will help. The other big push on a claim side that I will say, I think we're seeing benefits now, is the notification that your documentation is incomplete or insufficient rather than going straight to denial. It was a huge point of emphasis from our perspective, particularly in the fall and early winter. Many conversations and emails about what's going on. Why am I still seeing denials without an incomplete before? And I think that approach has also helped so that we can, as you're saying, Fran, reach out and say, this is what's missing. This is what you need to do to fix it, before we have to hit a denial and even get to the reconsideration. So I think hopefully we can continue making these sort of incremental and multi-pronged steps to achieve better compliance and therefore more approvals. Andrea?
Andrea, yeah.
Thank you. I guess want to close the loop on Marie's initial comment, and Fran, totally get the sort of labor intensiveness of some of the efforts to reach people. What I'm thinking is though, is if we are tracking by geography, if we are, then we can sort of look at census tracts and determine, is this a poverty issue along with an equity issue based on what the demographics of that particular municipality / neighborhood or community may be. I think it's worthwhile because it will help us more strategically focus our efforts and outreach if we know who it is that where there's this misfire with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100% agree. It's a great point. I mean, it's absolutely a great point. And we need to break it down as much as we can so that we can tackle the problem, tackle the issue, and make sure that people are getting the help and support they need. And I think it's multi-pronged. It's definitely an equity issue. It's also, in my own experience, it's, oh my goodness, it's just more, I don't have the time for this. Also, people are so inundated with information. They don't have the time, and it's also a big trust issue as well. I'm sure that's coming into play here as well.
Yeah, and if I could just echo one sort of piece of this, which is accessibility for people with disabilities, and also acknowledging the fact that many people are coming to us in moments of crisis. I realize that we don't have any type of in-person option for people, or at least that's my understanding, but I don't know if that's something we are considering for future years at all, or if it's something that any of the claimants may have expressed an interest in. But I just wanted to sort of at least have that be something that we consider.
So I promise that I didn't ask Britt Marie to make that comment, but it is perfectly in tune with a strategy conversation that the outreach team had yesterday, where we're going to be reaching out to libraries so with the hope of doing a pilot program where we can actually hopefully be in person to say, you know, come we're going to be here. We'll have laptops. It's just in the very beginning stages, but it's something that we recognize it's tricky to always be available. Our application is available and accessible on smartphones, and so that is one effort, but it's not always enough. So we are trying to think about in-person options, and so we will continue to build out that strategy and report back. Andrea?
I guess just one final thought on this is, and I don't, if this conversation has already been had or considered, I apologize, but I'm wondering about health equity solutions and wondering if there is a role that they could play in terms of assisting with that whatever that strategy is.
That's a great idea. We should really have some, I can do some outreach to Dr. Gifford. I just set up a meeting with Commissioner Porter at Aging and Disability, because we want to make sure that, going back to Britt Marie's comment, particularly about individuals with disabilities and making sure we're supporting them in the workforce. So there are partnerships that we can engage in. And I think you're right, health equity is another state entity that has similar goals. So I will put that on my list of people that I need to talk to. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Really great discussion and suggestions. Thanks all. Okay, committee reports. Mike, policy and personnel.
Good morning. Our committee did not meet this month, so I don't have anything to report.
All right, thank you. Molly, outreach and engagement.
We did meet this month. We got a really great update on all of the outreach work, including a lot of press hits, legislative work, and what the authority has been tracking, which we heard more about last month on the board meeting, and some upcoming podcasts.
Thank you. Dave, you are up again, finance and audit.
I'll give Holly the option if she wants to mention anything at the top before I do a financial presentation.
Sure, I'll just say that we met last month and we discussed the bond repayment terms and draft budget that Dave walked us through this morning, and then I'll turn it over to you, Dave, to go through the statements.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we definitely met last month, as you can probably tell. And so one of the things we did, of course, was go over the financials, which I will go over briefly with you now.
We can see your screen, Dave.
Okay, thank you for the confirmation. So we'll be going over the month of March with a preview of April and then projections at the end. So for the month of March, our operational expenses were just under $964,000. The significant expenses for the month were salaries, pensions, and benefits, contact center expense. We paid 2 months this month, outreach expense. Those three were the major categories for the month. We were better than budget by over $215,000 for the month. And year to date, we are better than budget by just about $5 million. For the bond account, we spent $256,000 this month, mostly on fund recovery efforts and our website redesign that's going on. For the month, we were slightly worse than budget, but we were expecting that to happen because most of the spending was budgeted earlier in the fiscal year, and the spending is actually happening consistently throughout the year. We are better than budget for the fiscal year so far by $3.7 million. We do expect that variance to decrease over time as the spending we budgeted earlier in the year continues to happen later in the year. As I mentioned earlier, we have $16 million of bond funds allocated. To date, we've spent just under $12.5 million. So we have $3.5 million available to the authority to spend. Our contribution activity for the month of March was as follows. We had net activity, of $29.7 million. That was better than budget by $8.7 million. The main driver of that was our benefits paid. We were at $30.6 million. That's higher than a normal monthly run rate, but that's because the authority reimbursed AFLAC for 5 weeks instead of 4 weeks. That happens for a few months throughout the year. But even with that, we were still better than budget by $6.7 million. The rest of the positive variance was due to investment income because we're earning a higher interest rate. And again, we are earning interest on the impressed account we have at AFLAC, so that helped a little bit. Our contributions for the month were $641,000. That is $463,000 lower than budget, but the investment income positive variance more than made up for that. Year to date, the activity has been a positive $65 million compared to what we budgeted. So we are ahead of budget year to date right now by over $110 million for our contribution activity. And again, the biggest driver of that is that the benefits claims that are being paid are less than what we budgeted during the year. Our contribution fund as of the end of March was $448 million at the end of the month. Biggest drivers of that being $823 million of contribution revenue from inception, and benefit claims going out the door of $320 million to date since inception. Just as a reminder, the benefits started being paid a year after we were taking in contributions. Just a quick view of our balance sheet, which is at over $471 million of assets. The biggest driver of that is the short-term investment income, which has $435 million. The liabilities we have are the bond funds payable, which is at $16 million. Quick preview of April. Our spending for April was $612,000. The categories are the typical ones. Our spending for this month was a little lower than usual. We had to freeze spending for a month because we converted Bank of America was using bill pay, but was no longer supporting it. So the authority went to bill pay directly instead of using Bank of America as a middleman. In order to do that conversion, we had to freeze everything for a week, which we did. We unfroze it in May and have since paid everything that we temporarily didn't pay. And I would like to thank my AP team, Amy Stewart and Shelley, who were very instrumental with the success of that conversion. Benefits paid for the month of April were just over $24 million. We are seeing benefits of being paid at about $6 million a week. That's typically been the run rate for the past few months. So that's been fairly consistent. And just to focus on money coming in for a second, April is when ultimately the first quarter contributions were due, and we got in over $130 million. We just accounted for all that. So next month I will share more of an analysis showing how that compares to prior periods. And then our interest expense was $1.7 million. Again, we're earning north of 4.5%, and that includes the interest from the AFLAC impressed account. What that all means for the end of this fiscal year, June 30, which is less than a couple of months away. Where does the time go? But by the end of the fiscal year, we expect our net operational activity to be $7.3 million. That'll be $4.4 million better than budget. That's what I shared with you before when we were going over the fiscal budget earlier. And the main drivers of that are salaries and related expenses. The positions were starting later than we had budgeted. And also, as I mentioned, IT consulting, we didn't spend as much as we anticipated in the budget. So that's also the reason for the positive variance. And the contribution budget, we expect that to be over $129 million better than budget. Again, the biggest driver of that is the benefits paid is coming in less than what we had budgeted at around this time last year. It's a very conservative budget. Again, we didn't have a lot of experience at that time, so we did budget it conservatively. So that's the biggest part of the driver, in addition to the certainly better than anticipated investment income because the interest rates went up. And contribution revenue is somewhat lower than what we had budgeted, but the increases definitely outweigh the negative amounts. As I mentioned earlier, we certainly did take that into account into next year's budget. That's what is happening at the authority from a fiscal standpoint. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks again, Dave. All right, since there are no questions, we will reach our item number 9, an Erin's CEO report.
Thank you so much, Fran, and thank you everyone for your patience with this chock-filled agenda today. We've got a lot going on that we haven't even begun to talk about. We've got the website replatforming and expansion. It's going to be about 4 times as much content. That's a conservative estimate too. We've begun working on the annual reports. You'll be seeing a draft of that in early June. Maddie's been working hard on the legislative issues, tracking 1179, which is a labor bill, which makes some changes. We've been working with different stakeholders and constituents to share our experience, which is what's informing some of these decisions. So we'll see where that goes, as well as many other bills that may not have as direct impact on us, but impact us nonetheless, such as bills that relate to conduct of public meetings that affect us multiple times a month. We are working hard on improvements, as you've heard, on the claims side, improvements on contributions and fund recovery. That's a major project. We're also doing administrative improvements. Amber and Stephanie in particular have been taking the lead on some of the unsung work, like making sure our documentation is ordered on inventory and on IT access and all of that. And our IT team has been doing yeoman's work and a lot of hours because we're running a lot of projects that all involve IT quite immensely, including particularly fund recovery, which has been a lot for them. And they have been just diligent in working through problems, identifying solutions, troubleshooting, and working through it all. So on a day-to-day basis, we're super busy and we're moving forward in positive ways. I'm noted that John and Michael were not here this morning because they're actually in Boston at a meeting of paid leave administrators, which grew out of the meeting that I went to in Washington. But it's really meant really for the internal stuff, the nitty gritty, the things that only we find interesting. So we're hoping to get some good feedback from there. Also out of the Washington trip, we began having more conversations with more researchers and just policy folks. Britt Marie connected me with the CT project, which was a great initial meeting. We'll continue with them. Had meetings with individual who used to work in state service in the governor's office, who's now at Yale and wants to sort of explore some research. We're also having meetings with the UConn School of Public Policy to really continue our role, not just in sharing what we do, but participating in the larger conversations. So I think that's an important thing for us to do. And we continue to receive requests for for information and data and to participate in the ongoing conversation, which I think is an important part for us. Private plan audits have begun. It's been a long time coming. We think we're still the first state to do them. That may not be true, but no one else is talking about it. So those have begun. And one of the reasons that we're able to do is because we have an associate general counsel now, which is lovely. Michael took up the step of general counsel, but there's still a lot of work, not to mention appeals. And so Joe Calais is here. I just want to introduce you for a moment. You can, I'll give you a moment to tell the board who you are and what you're doing, but Joe's been with us for now 3 weeks, I think, 2.5, and we jumped him right in on private plan stuff, on policy work. So we don't anticipate having to cancel any more policy and personnel meetings because we didn't have any policies to share. So we've got Joe working on it now. So Joe, if you want to just take a moment.
Yep, thanks, Erin. So hi, everyone. My name is Joe Calais. Come from at least the insurance industry, started at Aetna as an underwriter. Last 5 years or so, I was a consultant, have my law degree. So this was like a perfect conjunction of job qualifications. And I'm really looking forward to being here, meeting all of you and continuing this important work, which is paid leave, which is just expanding throughout the nation. So thank you, Erin, for letting me introduce myself.
We're just so happy to have Joe. I'm so happy to have Joe. I like being a lawyer, but I have other things to do right now. So it's really helpful. Lastly, we are still hoping to do at least in-person or hybrid, in-person/remote meeting in June. We would love to see you all in person. And so you will be getting, I don't know if it's going to come as a survey or an invite or whatever, but we would like to know if you plan on showing up in person for the June meeting so we can be prepared and have coffee and Danish available for everybody who makes the trek in. We think it would be a nice opportunity. Technically, everybody's terms end as of June 30th. Until and unless anyone is replaced, you continue on. And so we don't really anticipate saying goodbye to anybody, but we want to at least mark the occasion. And so if you do see that question, however it comes, please do let us know if you are able to attend in person. If you are not able to attend in person, that's perfectly fine. We actually, some of you may remember, we did this before. We had in-person meetings with people calling in, so it's still possible. And that is it for my report, unless anyone has questions for me.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks to you and the whole team for all of your hard work and still navigating all of the nuances that we're experiencing. It's still really, as an agency, still in its infancy. So thank you for your leadership and, of course, to the whole team. Any old business? Any new business? Okay, then we're going to ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Sal Luciano.
Thanks, Sal. Second?
Future Canada, I'll second.
All right, wonderful. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? And the motion carries. Hoping to see everyone in person. The meeting is adjourned and the time is 10:20. Hope to see you in person for the next meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. See you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Enjoy the beautiful weather.
Thank you.